obviously when it comes to um, I guess the definition built into what we call God, why should we even adopt these specific norms or these dialectical norms? Um, and obviously the definition is being impacted within the actual thing. Like for example, all powerful, causally efficacious. Why can't we just introduce a definition of a God who grounds, you know, probabilistic structure or offers restrictions for this probabilistic structure? Um, I think in that, case, then we obviously give a case for God given that definition. Why should we adopt the obvious, obvious like the traditional definition of God? Then operating on that definition of God, we can make cases for naturalism. And obviously, theism would have to be false. Why can we say that obviously theism is compatible with naturalism on their specific definition of theism we're operating in?
Um, I'm thinking that at the very least, there'll be lots of naturalistic worldviews that aren't going to be compatible with theism on that way of thinking about it. But I'm not sure that there's much utility in pursuing that way of thinking about God. On the other hand, I should point out that there's quite a lot of current discussion about different conceptions of God. And there are certainly a bunch of people who think that you can be a naturalist theist, and they have different ways of thinking about these things from the way that I do. And in the longer term, people will make up their own sort of minds about what's the most fruitful ways to talk. What really matters is that all of the positions that are entertained get taken into account. It doesn't really matter what labels they have. I mean, it's true that there are lots of people who want to be naturalists because being natural sort of sounds like the better of two options rather than being not natural. Um, but it's I'm not particularly concerned to fight about label you if you don't want to use naturalism the way I do, then you'll just have to give it a different name.
Awesome. And that wraps up my final question, Oppy. I think you're a very good looking man, a very smart looking man. And I want to say bye to Agent Sniper Bunny for me. I'll add you later. Then I
Yeah, sorry about that. I think you wanted to get funny joke in. Okay. Um, yes, so Josie, you haven't had a chance. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, I thought I was going to be maybe one of the last ones. Because I just requested right now, but I just wanted to ask maybe like an off-topic question about the industry of like philosophy, and it's like you've been in the sphere of like academia for a while, pertaining to like logic, for example, which is what I'm very highly interested in. Is like I know like it's a lot different than like the 21st century now, sorry, the 20th century where logic was maybe the center of philosophy. What do you think like the future of logic is like for like people who want to be hired or maybe just in academia in general?
I guess it depends a little bit whether you want to do what you might think of as symbolic logic or whether you want to do philosophical logic. The Journal of Symbolic Logic is now a journal that philosophers hardly ever publish in, even though originally it's an area where it was mostly philosophers publishing. That's because symbolic logic has really grown into a discipline on its own, and it's more a branch of than it is to philosophy. On the other hand, as in all areas, there are kind of boundary questions to disciplines that are philosophical. Um, and there's a lot of philosophical questions that still haven't been answered about logic. So if you're thinking about the logic of modal terms, for example, there's a bunch of technical questions, but there's also just some philosophical questions there. If you want to work on philosophical logic, then you're going to want to be in a philosophy department and you're going to want philosophy training. If you want to do symbolic logic, you might just enroll in a math department from the get-go and study algebra or related fields that are relevant. symbolic logic.
I see. My second question is like pertaining to like philosophy of like AI and like the intersection of like AI and like philosophy. Um, do you see like this industry like maybe kind of sorry, this field maybe growing in the future or like becoming like the most dominant thing?
Okay, so are you asking about the study of AI or the use of AI?
Yeah, like the study of AI and
Sure.
like maybe the usage like ethics with AI or like philosophy of language with AI. Like would AI center be like the dominant thing in philosophy departments or like things that are focused on? Because from what I've heard, a lot of like universities nowadays they increase like seats for or like jobs seating for like departments pertaining to like AI. I'm not sure.
Okay, so it's a very controversial topic. A lot of universities have invested heavily in AI companies and in return trying to get universities to use AI, particularly to embed it in their teaching. At least in philosophy, there's a lot of pushback against this because at the moment, what you can get and what you can get LLMs to do by way of writing a philosophy essay is just not very good. However, the situation's changing quite quickly, and who knows what LLMs will be able to do from now. But at the moment, there's a certain amount of antagonism between philosophers and AI companies, how I would describe it. On the other hand, there are lots of philosophers who are interested in what's happening. So you can think about points of view so that you could. And there's a lot of speculation about what the people that's although we haven't yet seen the enormous revolution that lots of predicting in the job market and elsewhere. It might be coming.
Oh, you cut out there a lot for me. What was the last part that you were talking about? Like, can you repeat that?
Sorry, the last bit was just about studying. I was talking about AI as a teaching tool in philosophy departments versus AI as a phenomenon in the world that's of interest to philosophers because everything can turn out to be of interest to philosophers. And I'm thinking that there's, and as I think you mentioned in your question, there's lots of scope for people to ask philosophers about the value of, for example, asking AIs for ethical advice right now. And then a different question, what will the value of that be in 10 or 15 years from now? How are AIs develop? Where I think philosophers.
I see. My final question would be, I've really not really thought about the question too much, so maybe it's not gonna be too clear. But what is like the skill level for, or like a level of knowledgeability that you might think a graduate student of philosophy might have, like relatively speaking, for yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's quite difficult. In Australia, someone coming into a graduate program will have done 4 years as an undergraduate, and they will have written roughly 10,000 word research essay. And that will be their background, and they'll probably go into an MA. And then an MA will be like a 40,000 word thesis, and then they'll go on and do a PhD after that. In the United States, it's a bit different. I think people will come out of a 4-year bachelor program and go straight into a more typical trajectory. And there's a kind of exit point about 2.5 years in. If you're not quite cutting it, you get an MA and say goodbye. And otherwise, you keep on going and finish the PhD. But it takes quite a bit longer. In Australia, the PhD is about 3 years. In the States, sort of 5 years minimum, can take 6 or 7. So what's the skill level? Well, That kind of only informative thing I said was, that intensive study as an undergraduate gets you to the entry point.
So maybe like somebody who can feel ease in going through the content material of all 4 years of undergrad pertaining to like the field of philosophy, there would be somebody at the level of a graduate student, is what you're saying.
It's not quite as demanding as that. If you've done 4 years of philosophy, there'll be lots of philosophy you know nothing about.
Yeah.
So let's suppose you do, say, 10 courses in that time, then you'll be good at maybe a dozen courses. Maybe you'll do more than that. It depends on the education system that you're in. So there'll be 12 areas of philosophy where you have some detailed knowledge, and it'll be variable, like the areas you looked at in first year, much about the areas that you looked at in your fourth year. And there might be some overlap as well, like you might have specialised mainly on philosophy of mind or political philosophy or logic or whatever. But that will be your background going in graduate work philosophy.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna give more time for the other people now, but I appreciate you, Graham Oppy, for coming to these communities. Sorry I couldn't ask you a philosophy question, but I'll dip now.
Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to ask, because I know you have like a lot of arguments against theism. You have like your argument from low priors and stuff. I haven't looked into that too much, but how do you deal with the kind of collective cases for theism? How do you respond to those? What are your preferences for fleshing out priors? And do you think that they would favor a naturalistic view?
I'll go back to what I said before about Swinburne's views. So Swinburne argues that the prior for theism is quite high because theism is a simple view. I think that naturalism is a simpler view than theism. And so on that way of thinking about it, it's got a higher prior, maybe not by much, but it's a bit higher. And obviously naturalists will disagree about how much more how much higher the prior probability of naturalism is to theism. The other bit of this puzzle, if we're thinking about it in Bayesian terms, is the likelihoods of all the various bits of evidence that bear on whether naturalism or theism is true. And if we're what the naturalist has to think is that when you feed all of this, the priors and the likelihoods through the Bayesian machinery, out comes the answer that the posterior probability for naturalism is higher. And what the theist has to think is when you do the same thing, the posterior probability for theism is higher. I think that it's kind of hard to really think about this in Bayesian terms because the assignments, especially of the prior probabilities, I don't know, they're loose, shall we say. And I guess the assignments of the likelihoods are too. And when we do kind of comparative, if we think about it, our judgments about whether one's more likely, much more likely, way more likely, or whether one likelihood is higher or much higher or way higher than another are pretty loose. And so upshot is that while the cumulative case arguments, at least in principle, are the strongest arguments, we're not going to get agreement on what the cases is.
I couldn't really hear what you said at the end there. You might have noise suppression on your mic.
I think so. It's just that my voice is tiring. What I said was that the difficulties of doing the calculations mean that while we might agree in principle on what that doing something like that Bayesian calculation is the right way to go, theists and naturalists are just not going to agree on what the outcome of the calculation is.
Right. But specifically, like, Do you think that when it comes to the priors of theism and naturalism, do you think that like naturalism heavily outweighs theism when it comes to your preferences for fleshing out these priors? And if not, when it comes to the cumulative cases where maybe we utilize something like, I don't know, fine tuning for life and discoverability, or like the miracle cases, etc. Like, would these not, like, even it? Well, I grant that like the calculations are going to be difficult and they're going to disagree on the answers, but like all these pieces of evidence, like regardless of the exact calculation, does it not seem like it would give a higher posterior probability? Like, how do you deal with that if you think
Okay.
that the priors are at least
So let
somewhat
me
close?
answer both parts of what you asked. So I think that the prior for naturalism is higher. Don't really have an estimate of how. I think on the other side that the likelihoods mostly come out equal. Right? We can't discriminate. Maybe there's some cases where one side gets some advantage over the other, but I am inclined to think not. In particular, I disagree about the fine tuning case. I think that there's almost no difference between the likelihoods in the two cases. That is the likelihood of fine tuning on naturalism and the likelihood of fine tuning on theism. They come out about equal. There's a long story behind that. I'm not sure you want me to tell it to you now.
Did you know getting pregnant in
Well,
Japan
specifically, I'm curious
it's
about
actually a marriage strategy?
fine tuning as it's argued by Robin Collins for discoverability in conjunction with life.
So we're getting married.
If you could give me the story, even if it's long.
Well, I'll give you a kind of abbreviated version of it. The thing to ask yourself is, so we're imagining a causal order in both cases. So in one case, we've got God. God makes an initial singularity. The universe expands, and almost everywhere in the universe, there are these constants. And if we do modeling and we change the values of those constants, we get a really different. The naturalist thinks same picture, except that you chop out God and whatever the creative act is that God does. So on both questions, on both views, we can ask this question: where are the values of the constant fixed? That is, where are they determined to be the values that they are? One answer that you can give is there's a beginning point and they were fixed from the beginning. That could be true on both the naturalist view and the theist view. On the naturalist view, the initial singularity, and it's either you're going to say that there are the constants and they take the values, or it's determined that at a certain point the constants will appear and they'll have those values. On the theist view, on this way of thinking about it, we're thinking that from the get-go, God is just determined to make a universe with those particular values. So that's how God's set up at the initial point. Now we can ask, what's the modal status of the initial point? Is it contingent or necessary? If it's necessary, we explain the value of the constants on both views in the same way. They had to be that way. If they're contingent, there's just no answer to the question. So that was just how they were from the get-go. Okay, so that was one. Next, the old competing thought is there's a point where there's a transition from the values of fixed are not fixed to the values of fixed. For example, perhaps back before inflation, but after the initial singularity on the naturalist view, there's a phase transition and the values go from not being fixed to fixed. In that case, it's a roll of the cosmic dice. It doesn't matter what the probability is, right? The explanation is it was just a matter of chance. Go back to God. Think about God's creative act. Suppose that God's creative act is indeterministic. There's all these possible worlds that could come out with different values for the fine-tuned constants. The fine-tuning happens not at the beginning, but at the point that God makes the universe. And there's all these different universes with different assignments of the constants. And it just so happens that we get ours. And if you want to put a probability distribution over it, let's go principle of indifference and make them all be the same, which is kind of what I was doing when I was describing the naturalist case. So in this case, it's just a matter of chance. There's some probability. Now, that doesn't yet establish that the values are the same, because we have some view about what's the range of possible universes that can come out on the naturalist hypothesis, where there's a phase transition. But what about God? What's the range of universes that it's open to God to make? What proportion of them are fine-tuned? Right? Here, I think we face a problem. Ignorance. We don't know. For all we know, perhaps fine-tuned universes are pathetically miserable compared to the universes that God could make, and it's incredibly unlikely that God would make a fine-tuned universe. In that case, what happened was a matter of chance. It's perfectly well explained, but to the extent that we're calculating numbers for probabilities, the theist isn't necessarily doing any better than the naturalist was when you think about the physicist's calculation of 1 in 10 to the 123 or whatever. Right? So the upshot is, either way, there's no difference in the explanations or in the probabilities that we can be confident about, because there's this kind of gap in our knowledge on the theist side when we go to the it's not fixed from the beginning, because we just don't know what the range of options that are open to God are. But that's the full story, more or less.
Yeah. Okay. Well, outside of the point about it being metaphysically, or like the modal status of the constants, are you just saying that otherwise it's a brute contingency?
Yeah, so that's the other option. It's a brute contingency.
Okay, but
That's if it's at the beginning. And if you think about it, unconstrained what the range of alternatives is.
yeah, is there anything, I guess that's more interesting then. Is there anything independent that makes you kind of want to view these constants as necessary?
Nothing independent, no. So I'm prepared to go, because it should be obvious that there's a question about certain kinds of cosmological arguments that gets sort of resolved by this same move. If there's a beginning point, I want to say we should think that it's necessary, whether we're theists or naturalists, right? And so arguments from contingency just don't cut any ice either way. And I started with that and then thought, oh, that applies very nicely to the fine-tuning as well.
So you think even a theist should commit themselves to the view that it's necessary? And do you think that the theist should commit themselves to that view for the same reasons as a naturalist?
I think so. I think that, it's true that in the tradition, there are people who want to derive necessity from the claim that existence is part of essence or something like that. I just want to set that to one side. I think I have something else to say about those arguments, which I think they're not very compelling arguments. But there's this consideration about the beginning point. Not all theists say God's necessary. Swinburne doesn't. And so there is a genuine choice there. And I want to side against Swinburne. I think it's better to go with necessity for your origins, but I'm not super confident about that. Right. So I'm quite happy to let it be. It doesn't matter really. It's just when we're doing the comparison, we compare apples with apples. We compare the assumptions of necessity with assumptions of necessity, and assumptions of contingency with assumptions. That's the right way to go.
Yeah, hello, Mr. Oppy. I just had two questions. So one of them is just, what's your view or just like your like opinion on neoclassical theism?
Okay, now I'm going to ask you what by neoclassical do you mean views like Hartshorne's? Is that what you've got in mind? A kind of open theism, or is it something
Could you repeat that?
else? So what kind of view do you have in mind when you're talking about neoclassical?
Um,
Do you mean open
it's like
theism,
Tom
for
said
example?
inside chat, just like the Islamic view on it. Sorry for cutting you off.
Just like the Islamic view. So you're thinking of that
Yeah.
as
They would. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, go.
Yeah. So they would kind of view that, like obviously, God would not have like this sort of, he wouldn't be like omnipotent, not omnipotent. Sorry, omnipotent. Sorry. Um, so they would view that he's like kind of, I don't know how to define this. Um, uh, Give me a second. Wait, can I just get back to you real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's all
Sorry,
right.
sorry.
Lev, you can been waiting for a while.
Professor Oppy, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you. I'm kind of new to the analytical philosophy space, but I'm learning a lot, hopefully. I have some familiarity with Daniel Dennett and computationalism, theory of mind. And I kind of approach from a philosophy of science perspective as a naturalist and an atheist. And I wonder what your take is on the idea of computational theory of mind, and if this gives us some reason to suspect that eventually our artificial intelligence will apply in a way that's meaningful.
I'm not primarily a philosopher. I wonder whether the idea that the mind performs computations is really the best way to think about the mind. It might be, but there's definitely alternatives. We've been going on quite a while, and my capacity to recall terms for philosophical positions is diminishing. So I'm struggling to remember the name of the kind of might be a decent competitor to computationalism. So one of the interesting things about the history of philosophy is often that ideas that are sort of dominant in scientific paradigms get imported into philosophy, and you can think of the computer as being a kind of very dominant idea in our world since at least since sort of the 1950s. And maybe it would be better to have a more biological understanding of the mind rather than the kind of digital computation idea. But I'm not sure. As I said, this is not my area.
That's fair. I was mainly curious if you were familiar with Daniel Dennett, and if you had any points of agreement or disagreement that you would have come to mind.
So I like what Dennett says in Elbow Room about freedom. I quite liked consciousness explained. So, as various people have pointed out, there are places where the work's a bit lacking in detail, but I'm quite sympathetic to, and this wouldn't be surprising, I'm quite sympathetic to some of the general stances that Dennett took.
Okay. So my main curiosity, for the topic in general, but for the question is, if theory of mind, maybe not now, but in the near future, maybe in the further future, if this is going to be relevant to our considerations about AI, are we eventually going to have to worry about dealing with minds and the ethics that are going to be attached to that?
I think that's a good question. I think that maybe this has something to do with the worries about computational models. I think that we should. The kind of interesting question is if we can build androids that, in many ways, behave similar to us, and presumably they kind of power up and down differently from the way we do. But in lots of other respects, they could behave like us, and those would raise all kinds of interesting challenges, I think, particularly.
I agree, yeah.
Right. LLMs are different because in principle, you can just switch them off. And in practice, we're probably going to embed them so deeply in lots and lots of our industries that that's not going to be possible. But that's a different issue. Whether something that's not embodied could be conscious is a real question. It's something that's not an agent. You might think that consciousness is just tied to agency, to actually moving a body around.
Thank you so much. That's all for me for now.
Thank you, Lev. So I realize it's been well over an hour and 48 minutes. I have to ask you, Professor Oppy, if you have an idea of how much you'd like to go.
We can do a couple more. I'm getting tired, so my answers are not going to be good.
Okay. All right. So how about perhaps 3, 4 more persons?
Yep. Okay.
All right. Batmail, you can accept the.
Hello. Am I audible?
Hi.
Hey. Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question was mainly that, like, why don't you think that identifying consciousness with brain states commits a categorical error, since one is objective and the other is subjective?
Well, I think there's a different kind of confusion going on in people who ask that question. Right? I think that say experiences are just neural events. So there's certain kinds of neural events, and a neural event is always somebody's neural event. It's something that's happening in a particular brain, and nobody else can be having that neural event, even if in principle you could observe it in various ways, maybe with brain scanning, and you could see a pattern on the screen. That's nothing like having the event. So the distinction that you want to draw, that you think kind of points to a category error between subjectivity and something else, I think is just making the mistake, not thinking about the difference between being able to observe an event and actually having that event going on in your brain. And so, of course, in the normal run of things, events that happen in your brain are not observable to anybody else. And the only person who knows anything about them is you, and you know something about those of them that are conscious because you're the one that has them. That's how I want to respond to that kind of question.
Dr. Oppy, this isn't my question, but it was someone else's question earlier. They were meant to ask you about Chatham's critique of Occam's razor and Thomas Metcalfe's argument where he says like anti-realists who try to employ Occam's razor are usually committed to an eroding ontology. Yeah, that was his question.
Yeah, so I think it depends what you mean by Occam's. The principle that I'm thinking about, I think, is the version of Occam's razor that goes roughly like this. What you want to do is to strike the best balance between minimizing your commitments and maximizing explanation. Now, you can minimize your commitments by being a nihilist, there isn't anything. But then you've got nothing. You can't explain anything. On the other hand, you could absolutely maximize explanation by postulating entities to fit any bit of data that you've got. But then what you'll be doing is overfitting your data. Right, so think about this. Think about a different problem where you've got some data points through it. You can make the simplest line you can draw is a straight line, and that may be quite distant from some of the points. If you put a couple of wiggles in, so you make it a first or second degree polynomial, you'll get a closer fit, right? If you put enough wiggles in, you'll be able to pass through every one of the data points, but your polynomial will be quite complicated. And what we want is some way of thinking about, in the curve fitting case, you think about kind of minimizing the squared error or something like that as determining what's the best point. In the general case, we want to postulate enough entities that we explain enough without overfitting the data that we've got. Right? And when you say it like that, it seems to me that it's a completely, it's just a kind of obvious methodological principle. It's not problematic.
Thank you very much for the answer. I'm guessing just one last question.
Yeah, that will be funny.
Hi, Oppy. It's a pleasure to have you here. I was wondering, my question isn't so much philosophical, it's more so, when did you realize that you wanted to study philosophy?
I was at school. I loved arguing with my classmates about the existence of God. That was true from when I was like 14. I didn't realize at that point that we were engaged in philosophy. When I was 16, I got given Bertrand Russell's autobiography for a birthday present, and I read it, and then I read it again, and I thought his intellectual life was really interesting, and I would like to be like him, not necessarily his person, but his intellectual life was.
Yeah.
So from the time that I was in about school, I was really interested in philosophy. It took me a while to actually get to working out that I was going to be a philosopher rather than trying to be a mathematician or a physicist or something else, but I got there in the end.
Yep. Thank you.
Well, I think Archie, I think that's pretty good. It's been almost 2 hours, so I think we've used our as much leverage as we could out of it.
So I should say thanks. I know some people have already left, but thanks to everybody for the questions. They were great. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Well, we thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's been a genuine pleasure, and I think I speak for everyone when I say this.
Yes.
Right. Thanks again, and everyone have a good rest of your day. Bye. Goodbye.
Fine.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for the event. It's actually sort of thanks to you that it lasted 2 hours. I know you guys are busy, so I'll make this quick. If you would like to see more interviews with perhaps other people, let us know, because we thought we would do this for the server, sort of get everyone excited, but we don't plan to stop here.
Yeah.
So feel free to DM Bunny, Archie, or myself if there's a philosopher you think are reachable. So I don't expect Craig or Peter Singer. Like, make it reasonable. We can try. It doesn't cost anything to try, so let us know, and we can make it happen. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for your time.
Subway, that is the worst phone I would use. Maybe iPhone X. It felt super futuristic when it came out, but by today's standards, it's got 3 gigs of RAM, first gen Face ID. I couldn't do that. It's a pass on the iPhone X, which leaves